The streetlights flickered under a gathering storm as Karen, perched in her oversized electric lift like a tyrant on her throne, barked orders into her walkie-talkie to cut the power to my house for the third time that week, her voice dripping with self-righteous triumph as though she were extinguishing a candle to prove her own brightness. But I stood firm in the empty driveway, the wind tugging at my coat, knowing that her obsession with enforcing petty HOA bylaws would soon become her own downfall when the thunder rolled and her empire of electricity collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. For hidden beneath her manicured lawn and squeaky clean facade lay the seeds of her undoing, waiting for one miscalculated flick of the breaker to unleash a reckoning she could never have anticipated. And as the wires hummed with forbidden anticipation, I recalled the first time she'd stomped across my property, her jowls quivering in indignation, accusing me of installing unapproved holiday lights even though they dimmed with every passing car, a trivial offense that she punished with the cruelty of a dictator while ignoring the massive illegal generator humming in her own garage that powered her mansion's nightly bonfire of landscape spotlights. And so I set my trap. I feigned helplessness, speaking softly into every neighbor's ear about how the power cuts threatened my newborn's oxygen machine, weaving a story of medical emergencies and heartbroken pleas, while secretly recording every call Karen made to the electric company, exposing her vendetta as nothing more than a personal crusade cloaked in community safety. And when the day arrived for the HOA meeting where she planned to vote to authorize permanent cutoff privileges, the room buzzed with nervous energy as she strode in wearing her trademark leopard print blazer, her arms crossed like an empress awaiting tribute, little knowing that I had arranged for the power company's compliance officer to attend incognito, armed with blueprints showing Karen's own generator violated every safety code in the book, from combustible fuel tanks within 20 feet of her propane storage to unlicensed wiring snaking like veins through her walls. And as I stood to speak, my voice calm but carrying the weight of proof, jaws dropped in unison, the lights in the community hall flickering ominously overhead as though on cue. And in that moment Karen's face paled, her bravado collapsing like a house of cards in a gale, unaware that her attempt to black me out was destined to expose her own darkness. And even before the power company rep revealed the violations, neighbors murmured about the torrents of noise and light pollution she'd unleashed for years, while I held up the evidence of her generator's certificate expired by 6 months, her permits denied by the county, and the safety inspections she'd forged signatures to pass, each revelation a thunderclap in the silent storm gathering behind her eyes. And as lightning split the sky outside, the HOA board members, her loyal council of otherwise respectable families shifted uncomfortably, realizing they'd been complicit in her reign of arbitrary terror, yet still bound by her charisma until I invited the rep to demonstrate what would happen if her generator failed during the coming hurricane, a simple flick of his clipboard sending a recording to the county sheriff's office, triggering an immediate shutdown order that left Karen's mansion engulfed in darkness even as the rest of the neighborhood remained lit. And so as the storm broke and rain pounded the roofs, Karen's screams echoed through the empty halls of her powerless home, a haunting symphony of hubris undone, while I, standing safely under my porch light, watched justice roll in on electric currents beyond her control. And as the HOA meeting dissolved into chaos, with neighbors rallying to revoke her special privileges and impose strict new guidelines on all backup generators, I realized that sometimes the best defense is to invite your enemy to expose herself. And now, dear reader, tell me, is it right to use her own rules as a weapon, or did I stoop to her level? Share your verdict, right or wrong. As the first gusts of wind picked up stray leaves and rattled window panes, I stood on my front porch clutching the last bit of proof that would seal Karen's fate. My neighbor's young daughter peeked out from behind her mother's legs, eyes wide as I whispered the plan I'd hatched with the electric company rep. Once the hurricane warnings came and Karen's illegal generator automatically kicked in, the rep would trigger the safety override he'd promised, cutting off power to her mansion and broadcasting a live feed to the county offices. The little girl shivered and asked if I was a hero. I smiled and told her perhaps justice was the real hero tonight. By the time the shutters banged against Karen's windows, the entire block was battened down for the storm, but only her monstrous home loomed dark and silent, an island of neglect in a sea of light. As thunder rolled overhead, I heard the first crackle of her generator sputtering to Lithian arrogant roar meant to defy the havoc outside, followed by an abrupt click and then utter silence. In that split second I pictured Karen racing through dim halls, her heels clacking like a judge's gavel, pressing buttons and yanking cords as panic twisted her face into a mask of disbelief. Meanwhile, I lit a single candle and left it by my window, a beacon of composure in the brewing tempest. The hurricane made landfall an hour later with shrieking winds and sheets of rain that erased the borders between driveways and lawns, but our block remained steadfastly lit. Each porch lamp, each floodlight, each tiny fairy light strung across hedges shining defiance against nature's fury. I peered through the rain-streaked glass as Karen's silhouette appeared at her front entrance, drenched and frantic, clutching a velvet throw blanket she'd grabbed in her haste. Her house loomed behind her like a sleeping giant, dark and powerless, while every other home reflected the glow of their interior lights. A flash of lightning illuminated her haggard form as she stomped into the night, heading straight toward my house. My heart pounded. I thought she might sue me for trespassing or demand retribution. Instead, she knocked on my door, her voice cracking as she pleaded for help, her words swallowed by the storm's howl. I opened the door a crack and asked what she imagined I could do. She lowered her head, admitting she'd never considered that cutting off her neighbors would isolate her too. She confessed her generator's wiring had corroded years ago, but she'd been too proud to fix it, doling out fines to everyone else but never sparing herself from the same scrutiny. The storm's anger had stripped away her defenses, leaving her vulnerable in a way no board meeting ever could. Reluctantly, I guided her inside, where my wife offered her a mug of homemade broth to stave off the chill and the shock. Karen perched on the sofa, trembling as she cradled the warm cup, and my newborn son let out a soft coo from his bassinet, the gentle hum of my backup power supplying his needs while Karen sat in darkness. Watching her eyes follow the baby monitor's tiny green light, I felt the power of reciprocity shift the balance. Tonight, we were the ones extending mercy. At dawn, the storm passed and revealed our block scarred but unbowed. Fallen branches and scattered debris littered the streets, yet every home except Karen's had power restored almost instantly. She stood on her porch, rubbing her temples, as a county inspector's truck rolled up and a team of linemen disconnected her outdated generator for safety violations. The inspector presented her with the order and a stern warning that she must comply or face hefty penalties. For the first time, Karen stood powerless not by choice but by consequence. Word spread that morning faster than the storm itself. Neighbors who'd once shuffled past her with feigned indifference now greeted her with cautious sympathy. They'd witnessed her brokenness and perhaps recognized their own in her shattered pride. I found her later, leaning against the peeling paint of her front door, staring at the muddy boulevard as cleanup crews hauled away the worst of the debris. I approached and offered her a ride to the hardware store so she could buy parts to repair her wiring legitimately this time. Without speaking, she handed me a sheaf of HOA fine notices she'd prepared for me over the past month. I took them, crumpled them in my fist, and tossed them into a plastic bin bound for recycling, an act both literal and symbolic. The bin clattered shut, and in that sound I heard the end of an era. In the weeks that followed, Karen attended her first HOA workshop not as president but as a student, sitting in folding chairs beside young couples who had never known her reign of terror and retirees who remembered her kindness before power had corrupted her. She learned about legal compliance, community outreach, and conflict resolution, scribbling notes as if they were sacred script. My wife invited her to join the newborn playgroup at the community center, breaking another barrier as Karen learned to bounce rattles instead of gaveling fines. Concerned neighbors volunteered to help her repaint her siding and replace the warped boards on her fence, repairs she'd once refused for lack of budget, but begrudged spending on her own home while imposing fees on others. One Saturday, the entire block gathered to install a new weatherproof outdoor generator box for her, funded by donations to cover the cost. As the electrician tightened the last screw, Karen wiped sweat and rain from her forehead and looked around at faces she'd once dictated to. She offered a soft, sincere apology to each person, and instead of recoiling, they nodded and thanked her for admitting her errors. That afternoon, under a sky half cleared of clouds, our block held an impromptu barbecue to celebrate resilience. Karen manned the grill, flipping burgers while kids darted through sprinklers and dogs chased frisbees. She laughed when the mustard jar lid flew off mid-squeeze, and her boisterous voice blended with the chorus of music and chatter. I watched my newborn Samuel toddle for the first time toward Karen, a cautious grin on his tiny face, and she caught him as though he were a fragile piece of porcelain. When Samuel looked up at her, confused by her size yet comforted by her steady arms, I realized Karen had been given perhaps the harshest but most transformative blackout imaginable. The community regained its pulse, and she found her bystander's seat replaced by one of service. As dusk settled, lanterns were strung along the park fence, and neighbors gathered around a bonfire I'd built at the old tree stump now charred but standing like a monument to endurance. Karen approached, carrying a plate of grilled vegetables, and set it beside the fire. She knelt and tossed a single log onto the flames, feeding the fire as she had fed our disputes with conflict for so long. The fire roared to life, and she turned her face toward it, the glow illuminating her softened features. My wife stood beside me and whispered, "She's not the monster we imagined." I nodded. Not anymore. As the embers crackled, I saw the truth. Sometimes it takes shutting someone's world off completely for them to see the light in others. Now, dear reader, the embers have cooled and your turn is here. Did I cross the line by orchestrating her blackout? Or was it the necessary spark to ignite change? Share your verdict, right or wrong.